It was a bright, sunny afternoon in the park, and Maya was enjoying the warm breeze as she sat in her wheelchair under a large oak tree. The park was her favorite place. She loved the sound of birds chirping and the sight of kids laughing and playing in the distance. Today, she had her book with her, one of her favorites, and a small bag of snacks. She felt peaceful as she flipped through the pages, losing herself in the world of the story. Maya was used to coming to the park alone. Her older brother, Caleb, worked long hours, but always made sure she had time to enjoy the outdoors. He'd drop her off before work, and after a few hours, he'd return to pick her up. Maya was a responsible and bright girl, so Caleb trusted her to stay safe while he was gone. As she reached for her water bottle, she noticed two police officers walking toward her. She thought nothing of it at first, assuming they were just patrolling the area. But as they got closer, she realized they were looking directly at her. Their faces were serious, and their pace quickened. "Excuse me, young lady," one of the officers said, stopping in front of her. He was tall with sharp features and a firm voice. The other officer, a shorter man with a slightly softer tone, stood just behind him. Maya looked up from her book, a little startled but polite as always. "Hello," she said softly. "What are you doing here?" the taller officer asked, his tone brisk. "I'm just reading," Maya replied, holding up her book. "It's a nice day, and I like the park." The officer frowned, glancing at his partner before looking back at her. "Are you here alone?" "Yes, but my brother is coming to pick me up soon," Maya explained. "He always does." The second officer leaned in slightly. "Where is your brother now?" he asked, his voice less sharp but still probing. "He's at work," Maya said, feeling a little nervous now. "He'll be here soon." The taller officer crossed his arms. "Do your parents know you're here?" he asked. "Yes," Maya said quickly. "My brother takes care of me. He knows I'm here." The officers exchanged a look, and Maya could feel their doubt. She didn't understand why they were questioning her so much. She had done nothing wrong. Her voice trembled slightly as she said, "I come here all the time. I'm just reading. I'm not bothering anyone." The second officer looked around the park as if searching for someone. "This isn't the safest place to be sitting alone," he said, his tone implying something Maya couldn't quite understand. "Are you sure you're telling us the truth?" Maya's heart sank. She felt small under their questioning gaze, even though she knew she hadn't done anything wrong. "Yes, I'm telling the truth," she said quietly. From a distance, a man watched the interaction. He had been sitting on a nearby bench, quietly observing the scene. The man, dressed in plain clothes with a calm demeanor, noticed the tension in Maya's voice and the way the officers seemed to press her with unnecessary questions. He frowned but stayed where he was, watching closely. Maya, meanwhile, tried her best to stay calm. She didn't want to cry or seem scared, but their questions made her feel uneasy. "My brother will be here soon," she said again, her voice steadier now. "He'll tell you everything." The taller officer sighed, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "We'll wait." Maya nodded, clutching her book tightly. She glanced at the man on the bench, noticing him for the first time. He gave her a small, reassuring smile, and for some reason, it made her feel a little braver. As the officers stood nearby, waiting and watching, Maya wondered why they didn't seem to believe her. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she hoped her brother would arrive soon. And she had no idea that the man on the bench was about to play a much bigger role in her day than she could have imagined. The two officers stood near Maya, their presence looming over her small wheelchair. She tried to focus on her book, but her hand shook slightly as she turned the pages. Their questions still echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't believe her. The peaceful day she had been enjoying was now filled with tension. The taller officer looked down at Maya, his expression still serious. "How long have you been here?" he asked. Maya looked up, trying her best to stay calm. "About an hour, I think," she said. "I've just been reading and waiting for my brother." The second officer crouched down slightly, his tone softer but still probing. "And what's your brother's name? Where does he work?" Maya hesitated. She didn't like how they kept pressing her with questions. "His name is Caleb," she said finally. "He works at the grocery store down the street." The officers exchanged a look, and Maya could see the doubt on their faces. The taller one sighed and glanced around the park. "It's not safe for a young girl to be here alone," he said. "Especially someone like you." Maya frowned, confused and hurt by his words. "What do you mean, someone like me?" she asked softly. The officer didn't answer directly, but his tone remained firm. "We're just trying to make sure everything is okay," he said. From his spot on the bench, the man in plain clothes continued to watch. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes stayed focused on the interaction, and his frown deepened as he saw Maya's worried expression. He pulled out his phone, discreetly recording the scene. Something about the way the officers were treating the little girl didn't sit right with him. Meanwhile, Maya took a deep breath, trying to explain again. "I'm fine," she said. "I come here all the time. My brother will be here soon, and he'll tell you the same thing." The second officer straightened up and crossed his arms. "We'll see," he said. "For now, we're going to wait here." Maya nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She didn't understand why they didn't believe her. She wasn't doing anything wrong. All she wanted was to enjoy her book and wait for Caleb like she always did. The man on the bench decided it was time to step in. He stood up and walked over, his movements calm and deliberate. As he approached, the officers noticed him and turned to face him. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice steady. "Is there a problem here?" The taller officer gave him a sharp look. "This doesn't concern you, sir," he said. The man smiled faintly, though his eyes were serious. "Actually, it does. I've been sitting over there, watching this whole time. This young lady hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you questioning her like this?" Maya looked up at the man, her eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected anyone to step in, but she felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe he could help. The second officer spoke up, his tone defensive. "We're just making sure everything is in order. She's alone in the park, and we're concerned for her safety." The man raised an eyebrow. "Concerned for her safety? Or assuming something else? She's clearly explained why she's here, hasn't she?" The officers exchanged a glance, their confidence wavering slightly. The taller one cleared his throat. "Like we said, we're waiting to confirm her story." The man crossed his arms, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Fair enough. But let's be clear. This girl hasn't done anything to warrant this level of questioning. Maybe you should consider how you're approaching this." The officers didn't respond immediately. The man's steady tone and calm authority seemed to throw them off. Maya watched the exchange, feeling a little braver now with someone standing up for her. As the man stood beside her, Maya realized she wasn't alone anymore. Someone was watching out for her, and that made all the difference. She didn't know who he was, but his presence gave her hope that this uncomfortable situation would soon come to an end. The air in the park felt heavy as Maya sat quietly in her wheelchair. She clutched her book tightly, feeling a little less scared now that the man had stepped in. The two officers seemed taken aback by his calm yet firm demeanor. For the first time since they had approached her, Maya felt like someone was truly on her side. The taller officer glanced at the man, clearly annoyed. "Like I said, sir, this is official police business. You're not involved." The man didn't flinch. He kept his arms crossed, standing tall and steady. "I understand that," he replied evenly. "But I also understand the importance of fairness. This young lady has answered your questions. She's sitting here peacefully, waiting for her brother. What exactly are you trying to accomplish?" Maya's heart lifted at his words. She hadn't been able to find the courage to say those things herself, but now someone was speaking up for her. The shorter officer shifted uncomfortably. "We're just following procedure," he said. "We have to ensure her safety." The man tilted his head slightly. "And do you think making her feel like she's done something wrong is ensuring her safety? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like intimidation." Maya looked up at the man, her eyes filled with gratitude. She didn't know who he was, but his calm confidence made her feel a little stronger. The officers, however, were clearly not pleased. "Look," the taller officer said, his voice sharp. "We don't need a lecture on how to do our jobs." The man gave a small smile, though his eyes remained serious. "I'm not here to give a lecture. I'm here to remind you of your duty, to protect, not to intimidate. And right now, you're making a young girl in a wheelchair feel unsafe. That doesn't seem right to me." The taller officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, another voice interrupted. "What's going on here?" Maya turned to see her brother, Caleb, walking quickly toward them. He was wearing his work uniform, his face a mix of concern and frustration. He had spotted the group from the park entrance and hurried over as soon as he saw the officers standing around Maya. "Is everything okay?" Caleb asked, coming to stand beside his sister. He placed a protective hand on the back of her wheelchair, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the officers. The shorter officer spoke first, his tone defensive. "We were just asking some questions to make sure she was safe." Caleb frowned. "Safe? She's sitting here, reading a book. What made you think she wasn't safe?" The taller officer shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence faltering. "It's standard procedure. We were just doing our job." "Your job is to make people feel safe, not to harass them," Caleb said firmly. "My sister comes to this park all the time. She's never had a problem before. So why now?" The officers didn't answer right away, and Caleb's frustration grew. He turned to the man who had stepped in earlier. "Thank you for looking out for her," he said. "I appreciate it." The man nodded. "No need to thank me. She shouldn't have been treated this way in the first place." Maya finally found her voice. "I told them you'd be here soon," she said softly, looking up at her brother. "But they didn't believe me." Caleb knelt down beside her, his expression softening. "I'm sorry you had to go through this, Maya. You didn't deserve it." The officers, sensing the tension, began to backpedal. "We didn't mean to upset anyone," the shorter one said. "We just wanted to make sure everything was okay." "Well," the man interjected, his voice calm but firm, "now that her brother is here, I think you can see there was no need for this interrogation." The officers exchanged a glance, then nodded reluctantly. "All right," the taller one said. "We'll leave it at that." As they walked away, Maya let out a small breath of relief. Caleb squeezed her shoulder gently. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I'm okay now." Caleb turned to the man who had stood up for her. "Thank you again," he said sincerely. "You didn't have to step in, but I'm glad you did." The man smiled. It was the right thing to do. We all have to look out for each other. As Caleb wheeled Maya toward the park exit, she glanced back at the man, who gave her a reassuring nod. For the first time that day, she felt safe again. As Caleb pushed Maya's wheelchair toward the park exit, he couldn't shake the anger bubbling inside him. He kept glancing down at his little sister, who held her book tightly in her lap, as if it was her shield. She was quiet, and while she had said she was okay, Caleb knew the situation had shaken her. He stopped for a moment under a shady tree and crouched down to her level. "Maya," he said gently, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. They had no right to treat you like that." Maya looked at him, her big brown eyes filled with a mix of emotions. "It's okay, Caleb," she said softly. "I just didn't understand why they didn't believe me." Caleb sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sometimes, people judge others without even knowing them. It's not fair, but that's why we have to stay strong. You did great, though. You handled it better than most adults would." Maya gave him a small smile, and Caleb felt a flicker of relief. She was resilient, but he still wished she didn't have to be. As they continued walking, The man who had stepped in earlier caught up with them. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but kind. "Do you mind if I walk with you for a bit?" Caleb turned to him, surprised but grateful. "Of course," he said, "and thank you again for what you did back there. I don't know how that would have ended if you hadn't stepped in." The man smiled modestly. "No need to thank me. I just did what anyone should do." As they walked, Caleb asked, "By the way, I don't think we caught your name." "Charles," the man said, extending his hand. "Charles Bennett." Caleb shook his hand firmly. "I'm Caleb, and this is my sister, Maya." "It's nice to meet both of you," Charles said, glancing down at Maya. "You're very brave, young lady. Not everyone can stay calm in a situation like that." Maya blushed a little but smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Charles." "Just Charles is fine," he said warmly. As they walked, Charles shared a bit about himself. He explained that he was a retired attorney who had spent much of his career fighting for civil rights and justice. He often visited the park to relax and read, but when he saw what was happening to Maya, he couldn't just sit by. "I've seen too many situations like that," Charles said, his voice serious but steady. "People in power sometimes forget that their job is to protect, not intimidate. I wasn't about to let them make you feel small." Caleb nodded, his respect for Charles growing with every word. "You did the right thing," he said. "It's frustrating, though. Maya didn't do anything wrong, and yet she had to defend herself as if she had." Charles nodded. "It's a sad reality, but moments like this remind us why it's so important to stand up for each other. The more we do that, the more we can change things." As they reached the park gate, Maya looked up at Charles. "Do you think they'll ever stop doing that to people like me?" she asked softly. Charles crouched down to her level, his eyes kind but firm. "I can't promise that everyone will change, Maya," he said. "But I can promise you this. There are people like your brother, like me, and many others who will always stand up for what's right. And with people like you, who are brave and kind, the world will keep getting better." Maya smiled, and for the first time since the incident, her smile reached her eyes. "Thank you, Charles." Charles smiled back and patted her shoulder gently. "Thank you, Maya. You reminded me today why it's so important to keep fighting for what's right." As they parted ways, Caleb and Maya walked home feeling lighter. Caleb knew this wouldn't be the last time they faced challenges, but he also knew they weren't alone. There were good people out there, people like Charles, who were willing to stand up for others. And that gave him hope. The next day, Caleb and Maya were back at home. Caleb was still thinking about the incident at the park, and while Maya seemed her usual cheerful self, he knew the encounter had left an impact. He wanted to do something to ensure that what happened to Maya didn't happen again, to her or to anyone else. "Hey, Maya," Caleb said as they sat at the kitchen table. "How about we write a letter to the police department? We can explain what happened and let them know how it made you feel." Maya tilted her head, thinking, "Do you think they'll listen?" Caleb nodded firmly. "They should. If we don't speak up, nothing will change." Maya smiled, feeling a spark of hope. "Okay, let's do it." The two of them got to work. Caleb grabbed a notebook and began writing as Maya shared her thoughts. "Tell them I was scared," Maya said, her voice soft. "But also tell them that I didn't do anything wrong. I just want them to understand." Caleb wrote her words down carefully, making sure every sentence reflected how Maya felt. They worked together for over an hour, crafting a letter that was polite but firm, explaining what had happened and asking the police department to train their officers to treat people with more kindness and respect. When they finished, Maya looked at the letter and nodded. "It's perfect," she said. "I hope it helps." "We'll make sure it gets to the right people," Caleb assured her. "And maybe this will be the first step towards something better." Later that afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Caleb opened it to find Charles standing there, holding a small stack of papers. "Charles," Caleb said, surprised but happy to see him. "What brings you here?" Charles smiled warmly. I was thinking about what happened yesterday and I wanted to help. I've written a formal report about the incident and included some recommendations for better training for the officers. I thought we could send it along with your letter." Caleb's eyes widened. "That's incredible. Thank you so much for doing this." Charles stepped inside, handing Caleb the papers. "It's the least I could do. Maya deserves better, and so does every other child who might face something like this." Maya wheeled over, her face lighting up when she saw Charles. "Hi, Charles," she said. "What's that?" "It's something to make sure the officers learn to do better," Charles explained. "You've inspired me, Maya. Your courage yesterday showed me that we all need to do our part." Maya beamed. "I'm glad you're helping." With Charles' report and their letter, Caleb felt more confident about making a difference. Together, they headed to the local police department to deliver the documents. Maya insisted on coming along, determined to be a part of the change. At the station, they handed the papers to a senior officer at the front desk. He listened as Caleb and Charles explained what had happened and how important it was to address the issue. The officer nodded seriously. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," he said. "We'll make sure this gets reviewed." As they left the station, Maya looked up at Caleb. "Do you think it will work?" she asked. "I think it's a start," Caleb said. "Sometimes change takes time, but every step matters." Charles nodded in agreement. "You've already made an impact by speaking up, Maya. That's how change begins." Maya felt a sense of pride she hadn't expected. She had always thought of herself as just a kid in a wheelchair, but now she realized she had the power to make a difference. With Caleb and Charles by her side, she felt ready to face whatever came next. That evening, as they sat together at home, Maya looked at her brother and smiled. "Thank you for always standing up for me," she said. Caleb ruffled her hair gently. "Always, Maya, always." And for the first time in a long time, they both felt hopeful about the future. The days after delivering the letter and report to the police department felt quiet but filled with anticipation. Maya and Caleb tried to go back to their usual routine, but the memory of what happened at the park stayed fresh in their minds. Caleb often found himself wondering if their effort would make any difference. Maya, on the other hand, remained hopeful. She believed that speaking up would change something, even if it took time. One afternoon, as Caleb helped Maya with her schoolwork at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw an email notification from the police department. His heart skipped a beat. "Maya," he said, his voice a mix of excitement and nerves. They responded. Maya looked up, her eyes wide. "What does it say?" Caleb opened the email and read it aloud. It was from the senior officer they had spoken to at the station. The message thanked them for bringing the incident to their attention and assured them that it was being taken seriously. The officer explained that their concerns had been shared with the department's leadership and that steps were being taken to improve training for officers to better handle situations like the one Maya experienced. Maya smiled brightly. "They're listening." Caleb nodded, though he remained cautious. "It's a good start," he said, "but we need to see if they actually follow through." Later that week, the doorbell rang, and Caleb opened the door to find Charles once again. This time, he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was the senior officer who had written the email, dressed in a formal uniform and holding a clipboard. "Good afternoon," the officer said politely. "I'm Captain Williams. I wanted to come by personally to talk to you and Maya about what happened." Caleb invited them in, and they all sat in the living room. Captain Williams spoke earnestly, explaining that after receiving their letter and Charles' report, the department had decided to review its training program. "We've realized there are gaps in how some of our officers handle situations," he said, "and we want to do better." Maya listened intently, her small hands folded in her lap. "Does that mean they won't treat kids like me that way anymore?" she asked. Captain Williams nodded. "That's the goal, Maya. We want every officer to understand how to approach situations with kindness and respect. Your letter helped us see that we need to improve." Charles chimed in, his voice calm but firm. It's a good step, but change doesn't happen overnight. I hope you'll continue to take this seriously. Captain Williams met his gaze. We will. In fact, we'd like to invite you both to speak at a department meeting next week. It would be helpful for our officers to hear your perspective directly. Maya looked at Caleb, her eyes wide with surprise. You mean, me too? Yes, Captain Williams said with a kind smile. Your voice is powerful, Maya. You've already made an impact, and I think hearing from you will inspire others. Caleb hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was too much to ask of Maya. But before he could say anything, Maya straightened up in her wheelchair and nodded. I want to do it, she said. If it will help, I want to be there. Charles smiled proudly. That's very brave of you, Maya. I think it's exactly what they need to hear. As they finalized plans for the meeting, Caleb couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his little sister. She had faced something unfair and turned it into an opportunity for change. It wasn't easy, but she had shown courage beyond her years. That night, as they prepared for bed, Caleb knelt by Maya's wheelchair. You're amazing, you know that, he said. Maya smiled, her eyes shining with determination. I just want to make sure no one else feels the way I did. You're already doing that, Caleb said. And I'll be right there with you. Maya went to bed feeling both nervous and excited for the week ahead. She didn't know what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready to use her voice to make a difference. The day of the meeting finally arrived. Maya woke up early, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. Caleb helped her pick out her favorite dress, a bright yellow one that always made her feel confident. As he wheeled her to the mirror, she smiled at her reflection, taking a deep breath. I can do this, she said quietly. You absolutely can, Caleb said, his voice full of encouragement. Just speak from your heart, Maya. Everyone will listen. Charles arrived shortly after to take them to the police department. He had been a steady presence throughout the past week, helping them prepare for the meeting. As they drove, he turned to Maya. Remember, Maya, your story is important. Just tell it the way you experienced it. Maya nodded, clutching her small notebook where she had written down some of her thoughts. She didn't want to forget anything important. When they arrived at the police department, Captain Williams greeted them at the entrance. He looked formal but kind, his uniform crisp and neat. Thank you for coming, he said warmly. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Maya and Caleb followed him into a large room where a group of officers sat waiting. The room was quiet, and Maya could feel all eyes on her as she entered. She tightened her grip on her notebook, feeling a bit nervous, but Caleb leaned down and whispered, You've got this. Captain Williams introduced Maya, Caleb, and Charles, explaining why they were there. Then he invited Maya to speak. Caleb rolled her up to the front of the room, and as she looked out at the audience, she saw both curious and serious expressions. Taking a deep breath, Maya opened her notebook and began. Hi, my name is Maya, she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. A few days ago, I was sitting in the park, reading a book and waiting for my brother. Two officers came and started asking me a lot of questions. At first, I thought they just wanted to make sure I was okay, but their questions didn't feel kind. They didn't believe me when I said my brother was coming. They made me feel like I did something wrong, even though I didn't. The room was silent as she continued. I felt scared and confused. I kept thinking, why don't they trust me? What did I do? I didn't want to cry, but it was hard not to. I didn't understand why they were treating me like that. Maya paused, looking down at her notebook for a moment before continuing. I'm here today because I want to help. I don't want any other kids to feel the way I did that day. I know you have a hard job and you want to keep people safe, but sometimes the way you do it can hurt people, even if you don't mean to. I hope that by hearing my story, you can understand how important it is to treat everyone with kindness and respect. When she finished, Maya looked up, her heart pounding. The room was quiet for a moment, and then, one by one, the officers began to clap. The sound grew louder, and Maya saw some of them nodding, their expressions softening. Captain Williams stepped forward, his voice full of admiration. "Thank you, Maya, for sharing your story. Your bravery today will help us become better at what we do. You've reminded us why kindness and understanding are so important." After the meeting, several officers came up to Maya to thank her personally. One of them said, "Your words really made me think. I'll do my best to be better." On the way home, Maya felt lighter than she had in days. She turned to Caleb and Charles, her smile bright. "Do you think I made a difference?" Caleb nodded. "You made a big difference, Maya. I'm so proud of you." Charles added, "This is just the beginning. Your voice will inspire others to make the world a kinder place." That night, as Maya got ready for bed, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced something hard, spoken up, and helped others see the importance of kindness. She didn't feel small anymore. She felt strong, knowing she had made a difference, and that her story mattered.